Thanks also to our sponsors Media Monitor, AdSwiz, and Live 365. Our next panel is on the topic of podcasting. Podcasting is, as you probably noticed, it's become hugely popular, both as a way for personalities to connect directly with listeners and for stations to offer archived content. They're well listened to, and they're popular with advertisers as well. Our next panel of experts, who hopefully are going to appear and come on up. Our next panel of experts will take a look at the podcast phenomenon. And moderating the panel is managing editor of Rain News, Brad Hill.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jennifer. Quick introduction of our panelists. Sitting closest to me is Mark McCrary, founder and CEO of PodTrack. And Brian Mott, next to him, VP of Digital Strategy and Sponsorship Operations for National Public Media, a subsidiary of NPR. Hello, Ram. There's Ram Kumar, the co-founder and CEO of Swell Radio, podcast listening app. Willie Sanchez, Senior Director of Digital Operations and Executive Producer for Fox News Radio. And over at the end, Chris Peterson, Director of Operations for The Blaze, theblaze.com. So we're here to dig into podcasting in all aspects, what it is, what makes it unique, how it's measured, how it makes money, the potential for this content category. I think it's fair to say that podcasting is in a resurgence. It started many years ago, but now consumers are more aware of it, even if they're a little bit confused about what it is, and we'll get into that. There's more breadth of content, and it's certainly a more mature business now than it was at the start, when it was mainly associated with amateur blogging. I'd like to start by asking how this resurgence and the changes in how podcasting is defined play into each of your businesses. Willie, I'll start with you. I told you I would. What does podcasting mean for you at Fox News Radio, and how is it key to your content mix?
Do you have my slides? I'm kidding. There's no slides.
Oh, man. We are way past April Fools. How white am I right now?
I knew you would be. The definition of podcasting for us has changed. I think for a long time it was the mechanism by which you downloaded audio, and I think that was very confusing to the audience. So our strategy has changed to, we still use the word, but we've started to interchange the word with on-demand audio. So whether it's streaming, it includes streaming now for us, as well as downloads. And what we've done with our websites is that anything that's on our website is available for download as well, but there are certain things that we just don't turn on. So what we try to do is highlight the ones that we think that are compelling enough and long enough to make it worth their while. Obviously a 30-second clip may not be worth someone spending the time to subscribe and download to it, but if it's longer, we'll highlight certain buttons that they can click that will automatically add it to their iTunes, Feedly, or just give them the RSS feed that they can use in their favorite downloading app, which there are a ton of them. So for us, it really includes streaming as well as downloads. It's on demand. It's sort of the convenience factor that we try to highlight for all of our users, that they can take it with them when they need to. Our mobile application use on our websites has grown to plus 30% now. So I think that making it easy for them to use it on those platforms as well is sort of just getting rid of the mechanics part. Give them a one-click button and try to limit the number of things that they need to do to actually get it.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting on a couple of counts. We ran a poll on Rain News recently in which we asked simply how many readers do listen to podcasts. Gratifyingly, about 80% said that they do. But there's also some comments registering confusion about what it is, and in particular that division between streaming and downloading. And so I think it's key, and it seems to be throughout the podcast industry that that division has become more artificial, and it's really more about just an online content program. Brian, podcasting is an important category, obviously, at NPR. Could you talk a bit about how podcasting is defined by public radio and how it augments the network's programming?
Yeah, I think we're pretty much in the same boat as you. We're kind of looking at it right now because we were out there early with podcasts. We've got a lot out there. You can see them all over iTunes. And we really didn't do too much after we launched in 2006. When was it? A long time ago now.
5 or 6?
2005, 2006. But we're taking a much deeper look at it now, and I think what's kind of emerging is the notion that podcasts are still really valuable because it is the subscription aspect of it that is very important. So even though the behaviors have changed a little bit in the sense that people aren't docking their iPod and pushing the content over to it and grabbing it the next morning and taking it out, they're finding you in Stitcher, they're finding you in the aggregators, and they want to be able to find fresh air. They want to be able to listen to it, the latest episode, whenever it's available, in a very easy way. So there's a value there. We've got about 25 million downloads a month from subscribable podcasts. And that number hasn't shrunk, but it kind of plateaued a couple of years ago, and it hasn't really grown. What has grown is sort of the on-demand access to individual pieces of content, which is kind of similar to what you're talking about. You can download a story from a web page. You can listen to an on-demand MP3 on a mobile web page. And that's a little north of 10 million a month right now, and that is what's growing. So I think what's happening at NPR is a look at, let's nurture the subscribable, I want to find this program or this Planet Money type series, and I love this content, I want to get it whenever I feel like it, wherever I feel like it. And then let's also make everything else that is of value available on demand via web pages, mobile web, anywhere else they can find it.
That's another interesting dichotomy, is that subscription versus the on-demand piece. I know that I listen to NPR archive programming, and as you were talking about subscriptions, I was thinking, wait, I don't even really know what that means to subscribe. I just go and find what I want and listen to it. So I gather that that's the trend line that's going up. And
it is, and I mean, those are still what I would think of as subscribable podcasts in the sense that you can find Fresh Air in Stitcher or TuneIn or everywhere, and you can find the latest episode and listen to it and go through the archives. So I think that what's interesting from our perspective is, it's hard to measure the audience to the podcast, but it's somewhere around 2 to 3 million users per month accessing those subscribable content podcasts. And then you compare that with a couple of million that access simulcast radio streams. And you also have that with 26 or so million who listen on the radio. There's a giant gap there. We're sort of super serving a small audience on one end, and there's a big gooey middle that I think Swell and some others are kind of aiming for.
So we're seeing, at PodTrack, we're seeing across all the shows that we measure, about 75% still of audience members coming through iTunes. Are you seeing more from other sources?
I was just looking at this in the audience trying to figure it out. It's tough for us to get with the tools we have now. It showed about 20% were listened to via iTunes, and iOS in general across iTunes, iPad, iPhone was about 60%. So it definitely has gone down. What's really hard to get at is, are they listening, streaming it kind of live as they listen to it, or have they downloaded it, are they listening to it at some point after? I don't know that number.
I certainly want to get into the whole measurement and monetization question later, and the apparent black hole that iTunes is, which I'd like to dig into. Chris, The Blaze is a news and commentary site featuring audio and video programs and also a live stream. Tell us what podcasting means to The Blaze for you as a business and for your listeners.
So we started the live stream last year, and they were doing podcasting, but from, Glenn Beck was our major show. All of conservative talk, for the most part, it seemed like they were doing, the Sean Hannity's, Rush Limbaugh's, behind a paywall. You pay $4.99 a month or whatever, and you get the show delivered to you. That's such an outdated method, and so is, I think, the term podcast. It's almost a stigma. Someone on our Facebook page recently, I was promoting a show, and I said, hey, catch the podcast, and they made a joke about logging on America Online to listen to it. It's a horrible, people don't know what it is. They think it's, listening to some guy in his basement. We like to use on demand, like you were saying. On demand, it's DVR, it's the Netflix, it's cooler. So when we rolled this out, a lot of people knew Glenn's program, obviously, but then we started getting original content for the stream, and people didn't know those shows. So I had to make podcasts available. I had to bring in people to the stream with no marketing money. So we really just started pushing, hey, if you didn't listen live because you don't know our morning show yet, listen whenever. Just listen to a few minutes and see if you like it. Well, from that, we've gone from, I think when we launched this, 20,000 downloads in the first month to, now we're in the millions, and that's in under a year. So people are consuming it, and I'm also seeing it's a younger audience coming in too. They just kind of laid over, I think, on a lot of the talk stations, and now they just say 3564 is the demo, where 5 years ago everyone was saying 2554. I mean, I'm seeing 18, 19-year-old girls listening to some of our shows. It's amazing to see this, and the interaction on Twitter, and then they share the SoundCloud files. So, we'll see some of our shows that, like, as a younger host of like 31 years old, his podcast is listened through SoundCloud primarily. Then, on the other side, Glenn, it's all iTunes for the most part. So it's really a marketing tool for us. That's the only reason I started it. And I don't care if you listen to the stream live. I don't care if you listen on demand. Just listen.
Ram, let's talk about the Swell app. It's actually called Swell. That's not just my evaluation of it. It's an innovation that I've heard you describe as a Pandora for news, and it also features comedy programs. It can't really be called downloading in the traditional sense, and it can't really be called on demand in the usual way. So how do you approach podcasting?
Yes, in fact, it's addressing precisely the problems that have been pointed out here on stage around the difficulty of downloading, managing podcasts, and people find it a hassle to choose the podcast they want to listen to.
Excuse me, Ram, could you hold the mic a little closer?
To choose the podcast they want to listen to, and to just to remember what to do it. What Swell does is makes it incredibly easy and simple, where you turn it on. It's like a radio where the podcast comes to you, and as you use it, it learns what you like. It learns the shows you like. It learns the topics you like. So we are really trying to solve the problem that several of you have pointed here, that consumers are baffled by podcasts, and they're sort of, what do I use? How do I use it? Which podcast do I find? Remembering to manage it. All of those problems are solved by the simplicity, ease of use, user experience on mobile. And we do a number of things around that. The algorithm-driven approach, inspired by Pandora, inspired by what's worked on music. We believe there is a market, there's a company and a service created comparable to the size of Pandora or Spotify or others that exist on music that do not exist in talk and news. So we're very excited about that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ram. Almost every one of you is mentioning that your users are somewhat baffled by podcasting in its term, and that reminds me that Kathy Lee Gifford's podcast, I saw she made a special one some time ago, the how to listen to my podcast in 5 easy steps. So there are some podcasters who are hitting that problem directly, although it sets up a conflict in my brain. Nothing is that easy if it requires 5 steps. Mark, your company, PodTrack, is a kind of a podcast 360. It's a full circle service that connects advertisers and online shows. So you have the final say about what is podcasting, and tell us just a bit about your business. But briefly.
I wish I had the final say. I guess audience members do, ultimately. But yeah, we've been around since 2005, and we work with most of the top podcasts in iTunes. Several thousand use our measurement system. So that they have some insight into their audience, and then so advertisers also have a good sense of what their, how big their audience is. And so then we work with most of the major podcasts and most of the digital ad agencies throughout the country, and then increasingly radio agencies as well. They were not the first to get into podcasting, but increasingly they are, and it's it's proven effective for a number of for all the advertisers that are in there. And I think, Brian's seeing a lot of increase in interest in podcasting over the years. I remember back in 2005, we were just trying to get anyone interested in advertising in podcasts, and we've done upfronts, 3 or 4 years in a row, and just to give all the brands that we work with the opportunity to be in the shows that we know that are performing for them, and that they know are performing for them, and so that they have that inventory for the following year, and so that's been a successful structure for us to work with the advertisers, and new shows are coming up every year, and it's it's been working out well.
Let's move on from what is a podcast to what makes a good podcast. I'll bring it right back to you, Mark. But Chris, I think it was you who said that there's a perception among listeners that podcasting is some guy in his basement.
Yeah.
Yeah, and probably there still are a lot of guys in their basements doing it, and that's certainly how it started. But Mark, you work with so many different programs and brands and personalities. What are some key characteristics of a winning podcast? And I welcome comments on that question from everybody.
Yeah, if we look at the iTunes Top 100, where 75% of the podcast listeners come from, we look at about half of them are produced by media companies or for let's see, terrestrial radio, and that are distributing their content as podcasts, and then about half is original content. That's in the iTunes Top 100, 200. If we look across all of the 200, 250,000 podcasts in iTunes, most of those are developed specifically for podcast distribution. If we look at the iTunes Top 100, about the average average length of an audio podcast is about 30 minutes. And so we think that that a length that's around 30 minutes sets up that expectation, or that asks the user to develop a media habit around that content, so that they come back, as Brian said, and subscribe to it and listen to it every day, every week, that sort of thing. So we think that that's so I guess the first thing is have a good length of content, have a great host. I mean, that's a big part. And then also, if for an advertising standpoint, if we can get the hosts of the shows involved in the delivery of the ad and do integrated ads, then that performs really well for the advertisers as well. But having said that, we work with a lot of public radio stations or public radio programs like This American Life and Freakonomics and others, and they don't do integrated ads so much in terms of the host delivering the ads, but they also are effective.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else with comments? What makes a good podcast?
There's a lot of bad podcasts out there. I was listening to some last week, and they sound great. They have like this big voice and music coming in to start, and then all of a sudden the guy comes on, and he's like, "Hey, thanks for listening to my podcast." So there's a lot of bad stuff out there.
So production value
is important. You know, the personality and presentation is important, but ultimately, for us, our formula is that the story is the star. It has to be a really compelling story that we're trying to tell. And sometimes, you have the other end helping you tell the story if it's an interview, but if you're presenting the story on someone's behalf as a proxy, you really have to be good at presenting that story and keeping the audience's attention. Otherwise, there's a lot of content out there that is just a rehash of something they've read on a website. And you know what? I'm covering the podcast space, so I hear there's a new mixer over there, and the mixer does this and that. That's not really compelling content. I mean, I think people who would tune into a podcast like that want to know a little bit more about the mechanics and what goes into creating the podcast that you're creating. What is, I want to know how you do it. So what's your process? So I think the human interest side of things is really what's most important in telling these stories, whether it be on the technical side of doing podcasts or really great storytelling. You guys do a great job with storytelling as well. So I think that's what's important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to say, having radio programs that are well produced, that certainly helps, and a lot of content we can mishmash into topic aggregations. But some of the ones that have picked up recently aren't even radio programs. Like Pop Culture Happy Hour is a couple of people on our arts desk got together, and every week they put out a podcast, and it's starting to get a pretty big audience. Some of the newer NPR programs, like Ask Me Another or Snap Judgment, they probably have larger podcast audiences now than terrestrial audiences. So I think it's all about sort of having that great personal feel and connection in the content, and also focus, so that every time you get it, you know what you're going to get, but you're always going to be surprised with sort of how good it is that week. Mm-hmm. So it's not a big surprise. You know what you're going to get on Snap Judgment every week, but it's always surprising to you the content they cover, but they do it in a very well-produced way.
Mm-hmm. My observation about podcasts over the years is that they are exceptionally chatty. It seems to be a characteristic of the content category. And even some very popular podcasts that are operated by big technology sites like Engadget and The Verge is really just 2 or 3 people shooting the breeze about gadgets. And they can last for 90 minutes, and they seem to be very successful. Chattiness, works well on TV and on radio too. Is this a differentiator, that informality in production of a celebrity or even a non-celebrity just sitting there and shooting the breeze?
Well, we work with Leo Laporte, and he is a very chatty technologist, and he gets his buddies together, and once a week they talk about technology, and they put out the show called This Week in Tech, which is the largest technology podcast, and his followers like to listen to him, and it's kind of secondary that they're talking about technology, I think. So he, and like the show that you were talking about, his show can go on for an hour and a half, 2 hours sometimes. So if then on the flip side of that, you have someone like Ira Glass from This American Life, who does a lot of editing on everything that they put out, and every second is intentional, and so it's a super smart show that way. So it's unedited on one side with Leo Laporte and hyper edited with Ira.
I think there is risk of, relating to a point that Mark made earlier, risk of losing a listener when the length goes beyond, let's say, 90 minutes and beyond an hour. What we find on Swell, the interface makes it really easy to skip, to listen to content, skip if you're not interested, move on to the next item, and we measure the listen rates, skip rates of content. We find that around 25-30 minutes is where there's an ideal length where listeners are patient enough to listen. Beyond that, they're more demanding. The listen rate drops, the skip rate increases. Around an hour, there's some really high quality shows that retain an audience. But beyond that, it becomes difficult. And especially with the choice of great content available, beyond a certain length, it becomes hard to retain an audience.
I think when we're talking about podcasts and content, it's the same thing with a live radio broadcast, or it doesn't really matter. Is the content good? Do you have something to say? Is it entertaining? If I'm really into this table and I want to hear someone talk for 90 minutes about tables, if someone's out there doing it in an entertaining way, I'm going to consume it, and I'm going to consume it often. Where Leo Laporte, his radio show is great, his podcast is great. It's people want to hear technology, and they like that he's a little bit more laid back. It's not as like Ira, where everything is intentional. It's a little bit loose with Leo, and it doesn't matter if it's Leo's show or Elvis Duran's morning show. I used to work with that show, and when we do studies, people would always say, I felt like I was at the party with them, and if they were at my party, they would come up and talk to me and bring me into the conversation. It's an amazing thing to be able to do. So I think it doesn't matter if it's live, it doesn't matter if it's a podcast. It's the same thing. Are you good? Is it interesting?
By the way, the next session is going to be about that table, and I think you're going to run it.
I'm sitting right there.
A recent study the Infinite Dial study by Edison and Triton recently disclosed that 30% of 12 and over Americans listened to a podcast in 2013, and 39 million listened to a podcast in the last month when they were surveyed. Willie, what's the addressable audience for podcasts, and what's the marketplace potential?
That's a hard question. We want everyone to consume our podcast, and our audience mirrors the television brand's audience. So we tend to skew sort of a little bit older with our demographics. But we try to produce shows that actually reach the younger audience, because we use social networking a lot now, and I think you mentioned it earlier, has sort of brought the age down for us. So a lot of the podcasts that we're looking at are targeted towards being shareable and consumable by that audience, and sort of lowering the age for ourselves. But the market it's obvious that there is a market there, and it's huge because we're all in the space. If we wouldn't all be in this space if the market wasn't huge. And I think the potential is great, especially when you broaden it beyond just the mechanics of downloading a podcast and increase it to including streaming as well, the definition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Brian.
I alluded to it before, but we kind of, in podcast to date, have been super serving an audience that really likes to self-pick and choose exactly what they want whenever they want it. They're willing to put in time to go find it, to subscribe to it, to do the maintenance required, or to hunt you out in the aggregators. And that, I think, narrows the audience potential fairly significantly. I look at the 26 million or so who listen on the radio with the simplicity of hit on and listen. And I think what we're trying to do is find the digital piece that will skew more towards that side. And I think Swell is in that same space. NPR is investigating this as well. And to me, that's kind of a hybrid of on demand with podcast, but in a smart listening experience that's personalized for each user, so that when you turn it on, you're not just getting what the radio programmer made, because you have a simulcast stream or any other means to get that, tons of ways to get that. What you want is something that's a little more relevant to you, takes cues from you, but doesn't feel like a machine smashed it together, still kind of has that personal touch and flow and feel of radio. I think that's what will hit that sweet spot, and that's kind of where NPR is looking to put a lot of energy right now. Mm-hmm. With local and national content is the other big thing, because it's got to be local and national. When you turn it on in your market, you hear local and national, and that's got to be a piece to the puzzle. It can't just be this faceless national content coming at you.
Mm-hmm. As always, we welcome questions from the audience. We'll have formal Q&A toward the end of the session, but either save it up or just make some noise and raise your hand now, and we'll bring a mic to you. Let's talk about M&M, measurement and monetization. Mark, you mentioned iTunes. I think you said 75% of the discovery, listening. What the? iTunes, I get the idea from my vantage point, is kind of a black hole. An awful lot of content passes through it. A lot of people use it as the interface to podcasting, but you're not getting much measurement joy from it. Is that right?
Yeah, right. So iTunes does not report back plays, and that's not a feature of their software that they've offered to artists, and so that's something that iTunes does not provide. What we have is a measurement system that works, that's kind of platform independent, as in terms of the different devices or ways that that audience members consume podcasts, and so that's the data that we provide, and that works on through different apps or and iTunes as well. So increasingly, we're seeing that mobile is. Last year was the first time that we saw mobile surpass desktop usage in terms of the downloads. What we do is analyze user agents, so we know that if a download is coming through a desktop or an iPad or Apple TV or iPhone, etc., and so we can look at mobile versus desktop downloads. And last year was the first time that we saw mobile surpass desktop.
As an industry issue, I mean, in audio's multi-platform market, inconsistent measurement creates problems for everybody. So is this an issue for podcasting? Is there any kind of standard of measurement of listening?
There is. There's an association that got together that Brian and I worked on many years ago, and the metric that we came up with was unique download, and that's still in sort of what we're using today. And that's because the main player in the space, iTunes, does not provide play measurement, so that the sort of state of podcasting measurement has not changed. At some point, if they do, then we'll look at plays, but that's where we are.
And I mean, boy, I'm remembering those days. There's still even a lot of confusion in that. So when I say 25 million monthly downloads, those are completed downloads. If I look at initiated downloads that lasted more than X seconds, that's like 50 million. Mm-hmm. So that used to be 4 or 5 years ago. We didn't count any of those because that was a mistake. You canceled it in your iPod and you never listened to it. But that's not the case today. To your point, long content gets skipped. So if I listen to 10 minutes of a 30-minute fresh air segment, I've heard the sponsor in it and I hit skip, that should count. So there's still a lot, I think, that is murky in this space.
And also measuring downloads, how does that jive with the trend of streaming, on-demand, one-click streaming?
As long as, it depends. How long did they listen? Did they listen to the full thing? Because the servers can give you detailed metrics on how many bytes were transferred. Was it a complete download or not? So you can do some calculations to figure out if they downloaded the full file or if they listened to 15% of it. It's hard. But there's still no real common language between the advertisers and the publishers, I think.
But numbers exist, don't they, at the server level? And can producers and distribution platforms and their advertisers do an end run around iTunes to find out what the real listening story is?
So, the data from iTunes, what I heard, I think, is that they try to keep the download number somewhat comparable to the actual number of users that downloaded. You don't know, to Mark's point, you don't know how many of them played the content from iTunes. What we do at Swell, we track much more granular information, where in the track the listener listened to up to skipped, how many hours they spent, what was the listen and skip rate for each episode, each program. We generate that data, share it with content providers. We can do that in the Swell universe, but in the broader universe, there is work to be done to standardize.
And I think part of the good news on this measurement is because there's this increased usage of mobile among audience members, that is probably more likely an instant play rather than a time-shifted download. So it's not, as Brian described earlier, the 2005-6 experience of downloading it to your desktop and then sideloading it and then listening to it on your iPod, right? So yeah, so it's a connected mobile device is where the downloads are increasingly coming from, which is probably a better proxy for plays than it used to be.
Chris, you look like you were trying to jump in there.
Yeah, I think as like Swell and Stitcher and all these really cool apps continue to get bigger and bigger, we're not going to rely on iTunes. I mean, I don't want to rely on iTunes. If they're not going to give me the information, what's the point? And I can go on Swell and create my own radio station and pick content from all of us, the content providers up here. And then I can also get, I can get hourly news updates. I can get the weather. I can get whatever I want in sports. And I just created my own radio station. So that's a whole other thing. And iTunes doesn't do that right now. So I think that as the Swells get bigger and bigger, that's what I want to promote as someone relying on these aggregators. I'm going to promote those ones and not iTunes as much. I'll take the downloads for now from iTunes, thank you. But moving forward, unless they start giving us information, what's the point?
I love it when people actually listen through our connected experience because we can actually track their play, pause, and stop. And that way we can draw some kind of, at least, picture of what's happening with the content and maybe anecdotally say that this is what's happening maybe in the downloaded space as well. At least get closer to that. The connected, it would be great if someone created sort of a codec that would phone home when someone took an action with it, but maybe someone in this room can create that.
Any questions from the room at this moment before we roll into the next question? All right, we've talked about what makes, am I over? Am I done? No, you're taking, okay. We've discussed what makes a good podcast. What makes a good ad? A good podcast commercial? Length, style, native, anybody?
I'll do it.
Mic on.
Quick one here is cheap CPM. So, I have to say, we started with very high CPMs in podcasts when we first came out of the door. We enjoyed some success while it was new, and then it kind of went down and flattened, and it was really hard to sell them, actually, at $20, $30, $40 CPMs. As we've gotten more radio buyers into the loop and trying to get like the large radio buying agencies buying podcasts, what it's really required is kind of downward pressure on the CPMs, so they're not too far above terrestrial radio CPMs. And that really turned a corner, I think, on as far as selling it. The ads that we sell are essentially the same ads that you buy on the radio because of where we live in this space. But that, to me, that's what makes a good ad is I can sell it.
Well, on the front, okay, I buy that, so to speak. But on the front end, what makes an effective ad?
Right. I think that I view it as the same as like the live read, except on a terrestrial side. Except there's really, don't just give me a 30-second one. Adam Carolla kills it with this style. He'll go into a segment, and I don't even realize he's talking about Mr. Coffee, but he's talking about something, and it's hilarious. And then it's, oh, well, we were drinking, my Mr. Coffee. It's not that lame, but that's how I think I would love to do it. I'm taking shows, though, that are produced radio shows, so I don't have that ability right now. In the future, am I going to say to my morning show, like, hey, give me an extra 15 minutes of podcast content, and maybe let's make it an advertisement if we're good at it? I think we could.
Yeah, we have a standard ad format that we came up with many years ago, which is a 10 to 15 second at the beginning of the show, and then a 30 second or longer within the show. And we saw that we doing some research on those ad formats through a third party, that the first ad position had twice the ad recall of the second ad position, and the second ad position had twice the engagement or interest level from the audience than the first. And so this ad position, or this sort of 2 ads per episode per advertiser, has turned out to be effective, and it gets the results. But to answer, so I guess the ad format is one way to think about what makes an ad effective, the position within the show. Obviously, you have to hit the right demographic, make sure that you're targeting an audience that you know, that you understand the demographics of each podcast audience. And then we do like demographic surveys per show, and so we understand those and make that available to the publishers that we work with, and then the advertisers as well. And then the integrated ads, as you were talking about, that Adam does, those turn out phenomenally for advertisers.
Great, thanks, Mark. Refreshments have been wheeled in, so I think we're done. Thanks for listening, and please join me in thanking our panelists.